What if police spent years hunting a serial killer who never even existed? It all started on April 25, 2007, in Heilbronn, Germany. Two police officers, 25-year-old Michelle and 22-year-old Martin, were out on patrol that day. The shift was pretty quiet, so they pulled their patrol car over near a park and decided to take a little break. Nothing unusual was happening, just a couple of cops sitting around waiting for something to actually happen. Unfortunately, something did. A few minutes later, someone approached the patrol car from behind and opened fire. Both officers were shot in the head. A taxi driver eventually noticed what had happened and called the authorities. And when emergency responders arrived, they found both officers outside the vehicle. Their service weapons and handcuffs were gone, so investigators believed the attacker had taken them before leaving the scene. And somehow, Martin was still alive. He went through several surgeries and spent 4 weeks in a coma. When he finally woke up, though, there was a major problem. He couldn't remember the attack at all. He had no idea who shot him, what happened, or where the attacker went. For investigators, that was a huge setback. They had a serious crime scene, one surviving victim who couldn't remember anything and basically no idea who they were looking for. Then they found something on the patrol car's dashboard: DNA. At first, this looked like the break they'd been waiting for. If the DNA belonged to the attacker, police might finally have something they could use to identify them. So they ran the sample through their records. And that's when the case got really weird. The exact same DNA had already appeared in several completely unrelated crimes. The earliest known match went all the way back to May 1993, when a 62-year-old woman in Germany was strangled to death with a steel wire inside her home. Then, in March 2001, a 61-year-old man was murdered in a very similar way. And in both cases, large amounts of money were missing from the victims' homes. So investigators started thinking they might be dealing with the same person. But then, later in 2001, the DNA showed up somewhere that made absolutely no sense. A child was playing in a park when they accidentally stepped on a syringe that had been used for drugs. Police tested the syringe, and somehow the DNA matched the same mysterious person from the murder cases. Now investigators had a pretty strange profile. They believed the DNA belonged to a woman from Eastern Europe who was involved in robberies and burglaries, possibly to support a drug addiction. And the more cases they checked, the worse it got. The same DNA was found in more than 20 burglaries and thefts involving cars and motorcycles. And these crimes weren't even happening in the same place. They were spread across Europe. Germany, France, Austria, she seemed to be everywhere. And yet nobody could actually find her. There was no useful CCTV footage, no reliable witness. Nobody could even give investigators a proper description of what she looked like. The only thing she seemed to leave behind was that same DNA. So eventually, investigators gave her a nickname: the Woman Without a Face. And honestly, that name fit. Even when 4 men were arrested for the robbery in France, none of them could tell police anything useful about this mysterious woman. But investigators still believed she was real. Then, in January 2008, the case took an even darker turn. Police discovered the bodies of 3 men floating in a local body of water. 2 had been shot in the head, while the 3rd had been strangled. The methods immediately caught investigators' attention because they were similar to earlier crimes connected to the mysterious DNA. The men had reportedly traveled to Germany to buy a used car, and police believe they may have been attacked and robbed after making the purchase. Now things had changed. Police weren't just looking for a mysterious thief anymore. They were starting to believe they were hunting a serial killer. Investigators from Germany, France, and Austria began working together to figure out who this person was, But somehow, the Phantom kept showing up. Over the next 3 months, her DNA was found at 7 more robbery scenes. Then it showed up inside the car of a 45-year-old woman named Diana, following her mysterious death in a swimming pool. By this point, the numbers were getting ridiculous. The Phantom's DNA had now been connected to more than 40 robberies and thefts, and 6 confirmed murders across 3 different countries. Think about that for a second. One person was supposedly committing crimes all over Europe, but nobody had seen her. No clear photos, no reliable witnesses, no fingerprints that connected everything. Just the same DNA. Something wasn't adding up. How could one person possibly be involved in all of this? And why did she keep leaving the exact same DNA behind, while somehow avoiding every other form of evidence? Police had been chasing this woman for years, but they still had no idea who she actually was. Then, in March 2009, everything finally changed. A man was arrested for a completely unrelated crime. During the investigation, police collected his DNA and ran it through their system. And when the results came back, it was a perfect match for the Phantom. Except there was one problem. The Phantom was supposed to be a woman. This was a man. And that's when investigators finally realized what had been happening. The DNA didn't belong to a criminal at all. It was contamination. Police went back and tested some unused cotton swabs from the same batches they'd been using to collect DNA evidence. And sure enough, those swabs already had the Phantom's DNA on them. That meant the contamination had happened before the swabs even reached the crime scenes. Investigators eventually traced the DNA back to a female worker at the factory where the swabs were produced and packaged. She wasn't a serial killer. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't some mysterious criminal traveling across Europe. She was just an ordinary factory worker whose DNA had accidentally ended up on the cotton swabs. And those contaminated swabs were then used by investigators to collect evidence from crime scenes. So every time they used one, they could potentially be adding the Phantom's DNA to the case. And suddenly, years of police work started falling apart. The mysterious woman who had supposedly committed dozens of crimes across Europe never existed. The Phantom of Heilbronn wasn't some genius criminal who managed to stay one step ahead of the police. She wasn't hiding in the shadows. She wasn't teleporting from Germany to France to Austria, even though the evidence sure made it look that way. Police had simply been following contaminated DNA. And as ridiculous as that sounds, there was nothing funny about the consequences. Real people had been murdered. Real families were waiting for answers. And investigators had spent years chasing a false connection that never existed. The Phantom of Heilbronn turned out to be one of the strangest forensic mistakes in modern criminal investigations. Sometimes, the biggest mystery isn't finding the killer, it's realizing that the evidence you trusted the entire time was wrong.